Hello, everybody, and welcome to Making Sense of Sensory Integration. I'm really glad that you're here, and I look forward to spending some time with you talking about sensory strategies and sensory integration as it applies to autism spectrum disorder. So today, we're going to cover several objectives. The first is to understand the development of the 5 basic senses and to identify the foundational sensory systems and their subsequent role in development. We'll also talk about understanding the basic premises of sensory integration theory and to appreciate the critical role of the sensory systems in daily function for all children as well as all adults. And finally, to strategize some ways to nurture children's sensory systems. So a sensory system is a network of neurons, and neurons are cells in the nervous system that form a pathway from the receptor site anywhere in the body or on the body to the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is the thinking part of our brains. And in humans, it is the most highly evolved part of our brain, which really adds to who we are as humans. Developmentally, by the 35th week of pregnancy, all of our senses are working. And as you all well know, the 5 basic senses are taste, smell, touch, hearing, and vision. And yes, there is something more basic than the 5 senses, but before we talk about those senses, we'll talk some more about the 5 basic senses and what you might observe when children are experiencing difficulties and challenges and how you can help. So before we dive into talking about the 5 basic sensory systems, just a brief word about hypo and hyperactive sensory systems. So while it may seem counterintuitive, a child who has a hypoactive, HYPO, active sensory system is one who seeks out a lot of sensory input, such as always needing to touch everything. These types of children crave sensory input because their brains perceive that they're not getting enough. On the other hand, a child who has a hyperactive sensory system, HYPER, is one who avoids sensory input at all costs, such as a child who avoids climbing on playground equipment or swinging. These children are getting too much sensory input for their brains to adequately process. So we'll start by talking about taste, or the gustatory system. The tongue actually begins to develop at about week 8 of pregnancy. And by about weeks 13 to 15 of pregnancy, the sense of taste develops as a result of chemicals in the amniotic fluid that stimulate growth of the taste buds. Very interestingly, a mother's daily intake of food directly affects the taste of amniotic fluid for the developing fetus. So for example, if a mother's diet happens to be very high in onion or garlic containing foods, then her amniotic fluid will bear a very strong likeness to those tastes. And recently, some evidence-based studies have shown that the variety of foods that a baby or a fetus experience during pregnancy or while nursing are the foods that he or she enjoys most. And maybe you can think about or even talk to your moms about whether they had any special foods that they were eating during pregnancy, and in turn, if these tastes are those that are very positive for you. So as we get older, our taste bud count really greatly decreases, which is why as adults, we find baby food to be extremely bland. And there's other factors that contribute to our sense of taste, such as our sense of smell and our saliva. Smell and taste go hand in hand, and they're constantly working together to help identify specific tastes. And you can really see this come into play when you are sick with a stuffy nose, and you probably have a very difficult time deciphering what it is that you are tasting. And another fun experiment to do is to perhaps lay out a pile of jelly beans and to close your eyes and to pinch your nose and to eat a jelly bean one at a time and try to determine what the taste or the flavor of that jelly bean is, chances are you're not going to be accurate. So the joys of taste occur primarily from our thousands of tiny taste buds that are very hard at work and contribute to our ability to differentiate between sweet, sour, salty, and bitter tastes, as well as providing us with a wide array and variety of what we consider to be desirable flavors. And there's a very interesting note about bitter taste. Many poisonous plants are bitter, which is a natural deterrent for people to eat them. And yes, we can't forget about umami, the delicious taste that spices such as MSG provide to foods. So what you might observe in the classroom when a child is demonstrating some issues with taste or the gustatory system is that they're showing food refusal, or stuffing food into their mouth, or excessive mouthing of toys. And some very simple strategies that you might employ in the classroom are to have a child brush their teeth before a meal or to brush their teeth for them, because this increases tactile awareness within the mouth. But it's very important that you not use toothpaste, just water, because you don't want to introduce additional tastes. The next sensory system that we're going to talk about is touch, and we'll actually come back to touch again when we talk about the foundational sensory systems. So the tactile system and touch are actually synonymous. And the tactile system is our largest sensory organism, and sensory receptors are located on the skin and our internal organs. So at about week 26 of pregnancy, the fetal brain scans show a response to touch. And what you might observe in the classroom for children who are having difficulties with touch or the tactile system are children who are engaging in excessive touching of objects, of other children, or those who are actually withdrawing from touch. Some strategies that you might employ in the classroom could include keeping a box of fidget toys handy, and fidget toys include items such as push balls, squeezy toys, squishy toys, anything that can be held in the hand and manipulated easily. You might hide common objects such as coins or small blocks, anything if children are not at a risk for putting these objects in their mouths. You might hide these objects in containers of dried beans or rice or styrofoam for children to find. It's an interesting tactile activity. For children who tend to withdraw from touch, it might be helpful, with parents' permission, to remove clothing tags from shirts, and also being aware of and conscious of trying to avoid crowding children together into a tight group. This really applies to children who have a withdrawal response to touch. So the smell or the olfactory system next. At about the 6th week of pregnancy, the nostrils are formed, and the position of the nose seems to shift into its proper place at this time in pregnancy. So soon, the nerves that are running from the nose to brain appear. At about week 7 of pregnancy, the eyes and nose start to appear, and although they may resemble an alien life form, if you will, they all shift soon enough into a normal appearance. By the 23rd week of pregnancy, the nostrils begin to open, and there's a study that came out of Belfast suggesting that fetuses at this stage have the capability of smell preferences. By the 29th week of pregnancy, the fetus is increasingly sensitive to changes in smell, and they actually may start to demonstrate some preferences for certain tastes and smells, perhaps, again, what mom commonly eats. By the 35th week of pregnancy, the sense of smell is fully developed. And in terms of what you might observe in the classroom with children who are experiencing difficulty with smell or the olfactory system, are gagging or children holding their noses. And some simple strategies that you might employ in the classroom to help children with smell or olfactory challenges are to be very conscious of and to avoid wearing perfumes or highly scented lotions, and to also avoid using air fresheners or strongly scented cleaning products in the classroom. So just being very sensitive to that. So now we're going to talk about seeing, or the vision, or the visual system. And the visual sensory system is the one that we know the most about because it's the most researched sensory system, but we still do not really understand how visual images are processed and identified in the brain. So this is really more than just seeing, but applying meaning and relevance to what we see, which is called visual perception. So there is a difference between vision and visual perception. Developmentally, at the 6th week of pregnancy, the lenses of the eyes appear. By the 8th week of pregnancy, development of the basic structure of the eye is well underway. And by week 10 of pregnancy, the eyelids fuse shut and the irises begin to develop. Eye color is actually determined by the 10th week in pregnancy, even though babies are born with blue eyes. At the 20th week of pregnancy, the nerve cells for taste, smell, hearing, seeing, and touch are now developing in their specialized areas of the brain. And the production actually slows down as the existing nerve cells grow larger and make more complex connections within the central nervous system. And our central nervous system is comprised of our brain and our spinal cord. So moving on to the 26th week of pregnancy, if you were to shine a light on mom's abdomen, the fetus will frequently turn his or her head, which, according to researchers, indicates that the optic nerves are working. And also at the 26th week of pregnancy, although they've been sealed shut for the last few months, the eyes are opening and beginning to blink. And as well, during this 26th week of pregnancy, a very busy week of pregnancy in terms of the development of vision, the retinas begin to form. By 1 week later, at the 27th week of pregnancy, the eyelids are open more, and a fetus can distinguish between light and dark. By the 29th week of pregnancy, the eyes can move in their sockets and are completely formed. Moving on, in terms of the development of sensitivity to light, by the 29th week of pregnancy, a fetus is increasingly sensitive to not only light, but to sound, taste, smell. And at the 34th week of pregnancy, a fetus can blink. So in the classroom, what you might observe in terms of children who are demonstrating difficulties or challenges with vision or seeing might be squinting, excessive blinking, or rubbing of the eyes. Some simple strategies that you can employ to help children who are appearing to demonstrate issues with seeing and vision are to keep the lights dimmed in the classroom and to avoid too much direct sunlight in the classroom. And interestingly, it's important to be aware of the patterns that shadows can cast in the classroom and also on desks or tabletops, because these shadows can be very visually distracting and misinterpreted. And also for children experiencing difficulty with vision or seeing, it's important to avoid extra visual clutter and stimulation in the classroom to keep it very, very simple as possible. So the next few slides, I will be inviting you to have a little bit of fun working on some visual illusion activities. So these are going to challenge your vision as well as your visual perceptual capabilities. And remember, visual perception is the interpretation of what you're seeing. So let's go ahead and get started with these. So, do you see more than one word in this visual image or visual illusion? I'm hoping that you do. In black, the bold letters, you were able to hopefully read the word good, but the word evil also appears in white letters inside each black letter. I hope that you caught that. So in this image, do you see two elderly faces or a larger scene? What do you see? So in addition to seeing an elderly man and woman, do you see two individuals wearing hats? The one on the right is playing a guitar. Do you see a goblet in between the two faces, or the apparent two faces? Very interesting, isn't it? And in this visual illusion, what do you see below? Do you see the shadow cast by the word teach actually looks like the word learn? Another one. So which of the middle circles looks bigger, the one on the left or the one on the right? Take a very careful look. This is really challenging your visual perception. Both are the same. Did any of you pick that up? I hope that you did. So do you see a rabbit looking to the right or a duck looking to the left? Do you happen to see both? This is a pretty challenging visual illusion. So now let's talk about another sensory system. We're going to talk about hearing, or the auditory system. By the 15th week of pregnancy, the three tiny bones in a fetus's middle ear have begun to harden. And while the auditory centers haven't developed yet, a baby might really not understand what's being said, but it's starting to happen. So when I'm working with expectant moms, I always tell them that it's very, very important for them to sing and to talk to their developing fetus. By the 20th week of pregnancy, a fetus may begin to startle in reaction to loud sounds. They can hear voices or noises outside of the womb, and familiar voices and music and sounds that a fetus becomes accustomed to in the womb are often calming after birth. When I was pregnant with our son, I played and sang a song, a very familiar song, almost on a daily basis. And when he was born, I sang it to him, and it was very obvious that this was something that he had heard before. He turned his little head to try to locate the sound, the source of the sound, and he did find that as an infant and a toddler to be a very, very calming song for him, and he was just a little agitated. So by the 27th week of pregnancy, a fetus definitely recognizes voices, and by the 29th week of pregnancy is very sensitive to changes in sound. And by the 35th week of pregnancy, like the other primary sensory systems, hearing is fully developed. So what you might observe in the classroom in terms of children who are struggling or having difficulties with their hearing or their auditory system are those who are rubbing their ears, who are crying and whining. And some simple strategies that you might employ for children who are demonstrating some difficulties with the auditory system are to have noise canceling headphones available for them, and to think about playing ambient recordings of quiet nature sounds at a low volume. But one thing to be very aware of in terms of music is it's very highly preferential. So if what you might think is a very calming and relaxing recording may be interpreted by other children in your classroom as not so. So think about that when you're considering music in the classroom, to be aware that some might not like what you think they're going to like. So we have covered the 5 basic sensory systems, and now we're going to talk about the foundational sensory systems. And for those of you that have heard about sensory integration, you may have heard about these foundational sensory systems that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about. So first, we're going to talk about proprioception. Proprioception is one of the more foundational sensory systems. And proprioception has to do with the perception or the awareness of sensations from the muscles and joints in our body. And kinesthesia involves perception of the movement of individual body parts. Kinesthesia is dependent upon proprioception. So what does that mean? Kinesthesia and proprioception guide us in understanding where our bodies are in space. So with someone who has poor or challenged proprioception and kinesthesia, they will often have trouble knowing how to sit down on a chair without falling off, or going through a doorway without crashing into one or the other side of the frame, or how hard to hold a pencil while writing and not breaking the tip of the pencil, or how much how much pressure to put on a paper or a plastic cup when drinking so as not to crush it while they're holding it. So what you may observe in the classroom for a child who's demonstrating some difficulty with proprioception and kinesthesia is children who tend to fall off their chairs, as we talked about, walk into walls or to door frames, those who walk on their tiptoes, and as we talked about, can't hold sort of a crushable object without actually crushing it. Some strategies that you might want to consider using in the classroom to help children who are appearing to demonstrate some issues with proprioception and kinesthesia are to have children stand about 1.5 feet from a wall, feet together, hands on the wall. It's pretty much at shoulder height and their arms as straight as possible, and ask them to push down the wall. It's always kind of a fun activity for children, usually gets them laughing, but it provides incredible proprioceptive and kinesthetic information or input to the upper body. Other ways to help children who are having some difficulty with proprioception and kinesthesia is to have them sit on beanbag chairs, or to work while lying on their bellies or tummies propped up on their elbows. You can invite children to sit on a beach ball inflated with about just 1 inch of air, and to sit on chairs with armrests. The armrests provide a really a definitive boundary of where the body fits on a chair. So the beach ball is actually a very low-cost alternative to what's called a disco sit cushion. And as you can see in the image on the PowerPoint slide here, that's a disco sit cushion. As I said, a beach ball is a low-cost alternative. You can invite children to jump up and down and to do any kind of heavy work, like pushing boxes filled with books or toys. Another way to support and to provide some extra proprioceptive and kinesthetic information is to provide children with tube socks filled with uncooked rice, sewn very, very, very tightly together, that they can lie on, sit on, or drape over their shoulders. And other activities include having children do crab walks, or working with them to do wheelbarrow walking. These are very nice activities to support proprioception and kinesthesia. So although we've already talked about the tactile system as being one of our 5 basic senses, it's actually considered by those who work within the area of sensory integration to be one of the foundational sensory systems. As we talked about, tactile pertains to the sense of touch. And as we also talked about a few moments ago, the skin is our largest sensory organ, and we have touch receptors a lot, primarily all over our body, but many, many on our hands. And of all places, a part of our body that is very, very laden with touch receptors are the backs of our knees. It's kind of interesting. So tactile defensiveness is a diagnosis that entails a person being severely averse to touch. Things such as clothing labels, touching slimy or unusually textured things, unexpected touch tend to bring about a very negative response, such as a fight or flight response, anger, withdrawal, crying. So as a way to kind of gain some empathy for what tactile defensiveness might feel like, I'd invite you to try some of these things sometime on your own. Put some tape on each of your fingers and try to go about your daily activities. How does it feel? Think about wrapping some type of rough cloth around your neck and type or write your daily lesson plans. Think about how it would feel, or actually do this. Crowd a bunch of people to very, very, very tightly together and move about in your room. So think about how this might feel, and imagine how this feels magnified exponentially for someone who has tactile defensiveness and has to live with this every moment of their lives. One more foundational than the basic sensory systems is the vestibular system. The vestibular system is the sensory system that responds to the position of the head in relation to gravity and accelerated or decelerated movement. The vestibular system integrates the neck, eye, and body adjustments to movement. So in short, in very brief summary, the vestibular system is the dizzy system and the balance system. It also definitely plays a role in movement. The vestibular system, when it's working well, helps to keep dizziness in check, and it's located in our middle ear. Someone who has a hyper, Hyper, vestibular system tends to get carsick easily, avoid carnival rides, refuses to go upside down in yoga, and are not fond of boat rides. The opposite is a child who has a hypoactive vestibular system is one who really seeks out a lot of spinning, rotational activities, and such. So for children who are experiencing challenges with their vestibular system, what you might observe in the classroom are excessive spinning, swinging or rocking, or avoiding playing on play structures or any type of an unstable surface. Some strategies that you might consider providing in the classroom would be the opportunity for children to rock in a rocking chair and to provide what I call graded exposure, which is just exponentially more difficult activities at a child's pace, with a great deal of encouragement to use playground equipment. So at their pace and with small increments, increasing the challenge on a playground. So let's start to bring this all together. Good sensory skills allows children or adults to effortlessly, or more or less so, engage in and participate in a wide range and variety of meaningful and age-appropriate occupations like play, work. For children, work is school, and taking care of oneself. The importance of good sensory skills can't be stressed enough. It's a must for children to get off to a good start in terms of their early development. So I invite you to think about life and how it would be if you felt threatened or overwhelmed by touch, by proprioception and kinesthesia, vestibular, by seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, how it would limit people contact, how it would limit affect and emotions, and engaging in friendships and playing sports, getting dressed, and participating in school. So if it's not evident yet, really, let me assure you that all the sensory systems are linked. We can learn to compensate when one isn't working as well as it could, but they are always linked. So it's my hope that by the time we finish our time together here today, that you walk away with an appreciation of the value and importance of our sensory systems. So for instance, without sound proprioception and kinesthesia, we can't feel, and our vision is impacted. With poor tactile or touch skills, we are either hyper or hypo-aroused in a way that we can't often hear or see well because we're so wrapped up in the tactile issues. With disturbed vestibular functioning, our balance is skewed and it often impacts hearing and seeing and thinking. And our sensory systems impact very much who we are and how we live our lives. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sensory integration now. We've talked about the 5 basic senses sensory systems. We've talked about the foundational sensory systems. Now let's dive into just a little bit of theory. So the late Jean Ayres, who was really one of the most prominent OTs, pioneered the field of sensory integration in the 1960s. So the roots of sensory integration therapy were grounded in neurology, psychology, physiology, and child development. Dr. Ayres was particularly interested in the way in which some children and adults seem to demonstrate a really great deal of trouble processing sensory information. They seem to demonstrate learning and attentional problems and just appeared to have difficulty moving through life with ease. And so she devoted the rest of her professional career to sensory integration research, and we're very grateful for her contribution to this area of study. So sensory integration theory takes into account more than just the 5 basic senses. As we've talked about, it suggests that touch and movement, think about movement as proprioception, kinesthesia, and the vestibular system, and body position in space, how they have a significant impact on the way in which we interpret our environment. So when you think of sensory integration, consider it as 2 separate words. Sensory or sensation refers to how we receive information from our environment without being aware of it. Integration, the second part of the term, is how we process and put things together. So combined, sensory integration refers to the unconscious ability for people to receive, to bring in, and to process sensory cues from the environment. So for most of us, sensory integration happens without us ever being aware of it. Jean Ayres describes sensory integration, and I quote, as the organization of sensation for use. So through sensory integration and organization, the nervous system comes together or organizes itself so that a person can most effectively and satisfactorily experience their environments. Conversely, on the other hand, sensory processing disorder refers to a disorganized nervous system. And so someone who's experiencing sensory processing disorder would have trouble negotiating his or her environment. Just getting through the day can be very, very challenging and very frustrating and very, very energy consuming. So when everything goes right, information is sent to our brains from each of our senses. Movement, touch, sight, hearing, taste, and smell is processed. Our brain tells us how that feels, what it looks like, what it sounds like, or how it tastes and smells. Our brains also perceive sensory information, process it, and report back to us what is happening. And that's really very, very basic sensory integration. You can also think about sensory integration as a term that's used to describe the way that the brain organizes and sorts out the many sensations that we receive. And we receive this information constantly. We're never without receiving sensory information as we're awake or asleep. It allows us to put together parts to create a whole, and it attaches meaning to sensations through comparing them with past experiences. It enables a high level of motor coordination, and it's the basis of perception. Good sensory integration, as we've talked about, allows people to effortlessly, or more or less so, engage in and participate in a wide variety and range of meaningful and age-appropriate occupations, like for children, play, working in school, and taking care of themselves. Sensory processing and modulation disorders, it's not a medical diagnosis, and it's very important to understand this. But sensory processing and modulation disorders really can interfere with a child's play, their self-care, and their academics. For instance, difficulties in play behaviors such as interacting or socializing with other children, managing their toys, and moving through space have been linked to sensory processing deficits. I think that one of the greatest risks that's associated with any type of sensory challenge are those that are associated with self-esteem. So specifically, focusing all efforts, a child who has to focus all their efforts on getting by throughout the day takes away a lot of time and energy that could be spent on developing a positive self-image and friendships. So let's talk about a little bit more about some sensory processing disorders. So the overall definition of a sensory modulation or a sensory processing disorder is, according to Lucy Miller, again, one of the most prominent occupational therapists associated with sensory integration research, is describes sensory processing or modulation disorder as a condition in which children demonstrate problems regulating, interpreting, or producing correct motor responses to sensation. So in order for sensory processing or modulation to be classified as a disorder or a dysfunction, the problems really have to impact daily living routines. Probably arguably we all have some sensory quirks, but for the most part, we're still able to get through our days. But when it impacts daily living routines, then it could potentially be classified as a disorder. Sensory processing and modulation disorder affects all facets of life. And because the sensory system is either over or underloaded, hyper or hypoactive, just managing to get by and not fully participating in life is all a child may be able to do. There's several subtypes of sensory processing or modulation disorders, and this includes tactile defensiveness, and this is it's a sensory processing dysfunction in which tactile or touch sensation cause very negative emotional reactions. And perhaps you're thinking about some of the children that you work with who demonstrate this. Another subtype of a sensory processing disorder is gravitational insecurity. And this is described as an unusual degree of anxiety or fear in response to movement or change in head position. And it's related to the very poor processing of both vestibular and proprioceptive information. Someone with gravitational insecurity may be a child who is unwilling to let their feet leave the ground, so may not be a child who actively engages in playground equipment. Another kind of sensory processing disorder could be apraxia. And one you might, and think of it, well, apraxia, a meaning is the opposite of praxia. So motor planning or praxis, those terms are often interchanged. Praxis is the ability for the brain to think of and to organize and to carry out unfamiliar actions. So if you were encountering a new and novel situation, if you have intact praxis, you're pretty much going to be able to work through any type of motor activity fairly effortlessly. Apraxia, on the other hand, is the lack of motor planning or disturbed motor planning, and what you would observe is very severe clumsiness and lack of organization with movement. So I'm going to go through a pretty long list, a bit of a checklist that talks about some of the simple symptoms that are associated with sensory processing disorder. But as I go through the checklist and I speak about them with you, it's important to understand that just because a child might display some or even many of these symptoms, it doesn't mean that he or she has sensory processing disorder. Remember, sensory processing disorder is pervasive in terms of its impact on daily life. So, but let me give you the list anyway, and it's a list of typical symptoms that could potentially be associated with sensory processing disorder. This includes falling off a chair, knocking things off desks, being generally disorganized, demonstrating clumsy, awkward, uncoordinated movements, someone that appears to be very distractible and have a short attention span, tends to be somewhat intolerant to stress and becomes easily frustrated, and despite adequate hearing, tends to engage in a lot of daydreaming or inattentiveness. You might see someone who's very irritable and demonstrates frequent mood changes. Someone who is demonstrating aggressive behavior and tends to bump into or push others. Someone with a sensory processing disorder, as we've talked about, might be very aversive to touch or to tactile input, may avoid messy activities. Someone with a sensory processing disorder may be showing signs of hyperactivity, being in very constant motion with no apparent purpose. Might be a child who's very hypo, HYPO, active, and is very, very slow moving and tends to either limit or not participate in movement. Speech and language problems have been associated with sensory processing disorder, as has been poor fine motor coordination, fine motor meaning those activities that we do with our hands and fingers. And another thing that's associated with sensory processing disorder is having trouble learning to read or to do mathematical activities. Oops, back one. So some of the typical treatment approaches. Typical treatment involves first a clinical assessment and then a treatment regimen set up by a certified therapist. And this, when we're talking about this, it tends to be an occupational therapist, and it's an occupational therapist who is certified to administer a standardized assessment tool called the Sensory Integration and Praxis Test. What may come of a sensory evaluation that is implemented both at home and at school is the development of what's called a sensory diet. So perhaps as you, assuming that many of you are educators, your role is not to treat sensory integration disorder or sensory modulation disorder, but instead, as best you can, to understand it and to support the child by, if they have one, following very, very closely a child's sensory diet and incorporating some of the sensory strategies that we've talked about, and perhaps an occupational therapist who's evaluated any children in your classroom to really incorporate some of these strategies into a child's daily classroom routine. As I think I'm alluding to, if you have concerns about a child's sensory integration or sensory processing skills, and they have had an evaluation, certainly speak with an occupational therapist about how you can help. But even if you have concerns, it's important to voice them with an occupational therapist for potential future evaluation. It's very, very important that you facilitate any type of a sensory diet with a child. Sorry, I keep going back on that. So let me tell you a little bit about a sensory diet. It's a set plan of simple activities that are designed to either alert or to calm a child. Sensory diets can be written for a classroom or they can be written to use at home. Occupational therapists typically prepare sensory diets for children who have demonstrated sensory processing or modulation disorders. And hopefully, any good occupational therapist will train a teacher on specific ways to implement the diet in the classroom. So some examples of alerting activities that might be included in a sensory diet might be things like wall push-ups or wheelbarrow walks. Some examples of calming activities that might be written into a sensory diet could be listening to a preferred musical selection through headphones, or a lotion massage to the hands, or having a child do child's pose in yoga. Typically, a sensory diet should not take more than 5 to 10 minutes to complete. And it's very important as someone who's carrying over a sensory diet for a child or with a child, it's important to follow directions on the diet as to when and where to carry out the activities with a child. Sometimes it would be helpful, and this would be something that is worked out with between you and the parents or the occupational therapist, to document when the sensory diet is carried out and any observations that you have of the child's behavior after doing the activities that are incorporated in the sensory diet. So what can you do to help? There's a lot that you can do to help, and we certainly have talked about carrying out a sensory diet in the classroom if that's something that's been addressed by an occupational therapist for children. Also carrying out some of the simple strategies that we've discussed. And let me just leave you with another thought, that all of the senses, both the 5 basic senses as well as the foundational senses, can be nurtured when children are outside playing. While it's not formal therapy, it certainly is sensory exposure. We've talked about this. So let me talk a little bit more about some alerting activities that you might engage in with children who need to kind of have their sensory systems brought up a little bit. You might do some brisk rubbing on their hands or their feet or their backs as they tolerate it. A little bit of light tickling. Light tickling is alerting. Chewing gum or chewy food tends to be very alerting. Engaging children in push and pull activities and running and skipping and lifting objects. Kicking and bouncing and throwing balls. Bright lighting tends to be very alerting. Loud, fast music gets you upbeat and moving. Cold water play, if you can tolerate that, is very alerting. Carbonated drinkings tend to be very alerting and perk us up. And exercise and dancing are also very nice ways to help alert a child who tends to be somewhat low in their registration. Some calming activities would be deep pressure massage, not light tickling, but deep pressure. Deep pressure might be a little bit of pressure through the shoulders while a child is sitting. Having children lay on or sit on bean bags or a large pillow. Weighted lap pads or vests can be very, very calming. And in fact, today I was just at the dentist, and they took some x-rays and had the lead apron on me. And I actually, for the rest of the visit, asked to just keep it on because I felt like it was very calming and relaxing to have it on my chest. Bear hugs, deep pressure, again, tends to be very calming. Rocking, slow rocking is calming. Fast rocking is alerting. Firm, deep pressure lotion rubs with unscented lotion can be very calming. Soft lighting instead of bright lighting is very calming. Soft and slow music, unlike loud and bright music, is calming. Chewing gum, although it's an alerting activity, for some it can actually be calming. It crosses both ways. Sucking on things tends to be calming, and doing relaxation exercises such as yoga can be very, very helpful. So as we come to the end of our time together today, this is a list, and I can keep this up, of some suggested readings. And I would like to also recommend another excellent online resource, which is otawatertown.com. That's OTA Watertown, WATERTON.com. This is the home of a very outstanding clinic that treats children with sensory integration challenges, located in Watertown, Massachusetts. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor for some questions. And if you'll go ahead and type them in, I'm happy to respond to them. And I thank you very much for your time. And right now I see that Alex is in the process of typing. Thank you for your kind words. Well, if I see that there's no other further questions, I think that we'll end for today. And again, thank you oh, sorry, someone is typing. Thank you very much for your time. And really think about how our senses really do impact everything we do in our day, and how it's very, very important to work with children and adults to help regulate their senses so that they can most optimally participate in their daily lives. I will write down the Watertown link right here for you. Thank you for that reminder. Again, thank you very much for your time and have a great day.